Hi everyone, my name is Aaron Watts, and for the next 5 minutes we'll be looking at the concept of colonisation and its impact on not only Australian Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people, but also Indigenous and First Nation people internationally. Throughout this presentation, we'll also be looking at artworks by Gordon Bennett, an Australian Indigenous artist whose art has emerged from issues generated by colonisation. As Parodies in 2016 suggests, the term colonisation is comprised of predominantly historical practices, including war, displacement, slavery, the removal and relocation of children, as well as the banning and prohibition of Indigenous languages, social, cultural and spiritual practices, where Indigenous people are threatened by ongoing structures of domination. The non-recognition of Australian Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people provided the reasoning for Australia to be declared terra nullius, which led to the invasion of British settlers in 1788, where Australian Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people were subject to rape, massacre, starvation and introduced diseases, which were justified by governmental policies. The colonisation or the decolonisation of Australia and the historical traumas that are associated with the concept, Parodies suggests contribute to issues relating to Indigenous people's health, economic, social and cultural experiences, as well as issues relating to their identity and indigeneity. Not only are the contemporary issues of colonisation seen in Australia, Hilary, Weaver and Braveheart state that the historical traumas related to colonisation are apparent in Native American people, while also stating colonisation has resulted in an altered state of an Indian sense of self, while also resulting in problems related to substance abuse and domestic violence. Gordon Bennett is an Australian Indigenous artist whose art career began in 1988. Having already worked as a fitter and turner, as well as a telecom linesman, Bennett entered the Queensland College of Art at Griffith University in 1986, after which Bennett describes his Aboriginality was only discovered as an adult, where identity issues as a result of post-colonial policies were an influencer of his art. Throughout his career, Bennett created artworks that challenged and often confronted audiences through the reinterpretation of Australia's colonial past. In 1991, Bennett released Possession Island, which, as Lingard states, recontextualises common historical and colonial images from Australian history, especially from social studies textbooks from his youth. Through his painting Possession Island, Bennett reworks a school textbook's representation of the European colonisation in Australia and challenges audiences to rethink the meanings attached to these historical images. In April 1991, Bennett released a series of cartoon-like images entitled Valley of Dry Bones, in response to a newspaper report that presented the discovery of a number of dismembered Indigenous bodies uncovered by erosion. These were remnants of a massacre of Indigenous people that occurred near Hornet Bank, Queensland. The first in the series of images, titled Valley of Dry Bones to the Sound of Cicadas, depicts a young Indigenous Australian mourning the victims of the massacre while trying to connect with the skull of one of the victims. Opposite the grieving man stand the blocks which signify the foundations of the English language, which stand as a monument to European civilization in Australia. Set into these blocks are also pictures of early European settlement in Lane Cove, Sydney, while the other shows a European couple admiring their newly acquired land with their backs to the massacre, as if they've had rights to it for centuries. The remaining artworks in this series depict the ways in which European settlers have defined colonisation in Australia. For example, Bennett's artwork titled Bounty Hunters displays reference to the widespread practice of collecting Indigenous body parts to fuel the interests of anthropologists and other scientists. The reward for these parts were often so great that graves were robbed, but, as pictured, Indigenous people were killed and decapitated for this purpose. Bennett's artworks show strong links to Parodies' notion of the historical traumas that are related to colonisation, while also reflecting Buchanan Heath's suggestion that the non-recognition of Indigenous people and their land justified the actions of the European settlers. In summary, the non-recognition of Australian Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people and the effects of European colonisation in Australia has a major impact on Indigenous peoples' identity and indigeneity. Through the artworks of Australian Indigenous artist Gordon Bennett, we are not only forced to rethink the concept of colonisation, but also think about issues relating to identity. In our classrooms, it's important to recognise that the Australian continent was never terra nullius, and that Australian history did not start in 1788. When teaching Australian history, it's important to use respectful and appropriate terms, avoiding terms such as discovery, as this, as Harrison and Selwood state, lock Australian Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people out of history. Thanks for listening.